And I think there's something incredibly insightful there and something we can learn from about how once we've reached a certain point in our career, it's so important to flick the switch and say, what is our vocation? Like, what is it that we're leaving in the world? Not worry about the outcomes because we're in the privileged position where we don't have to worry about them. But what is it that I want to leave in this world?
Perfectionism. While it may be the obvious answer to the old interview question about what is your greatest weakness, the potential negative influence it can have on our lives is palatable, and none of us are immune. Today, we have the privilege of having Dr. Thomas Curran, best-selling author of the hugely popular book, The Perfection Trap, Embracing the Power of Good Enough. He is also a professor of psychology at the London School of Economics and author of a landmark study the BBC hailed as the first to compare perfectionism across generations. Oh, and by the way, his TED Talk on the subject has received more than 3 million views. Thank you for joining us here on the Catalyst 360 podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brad Cooper, CEO of Catalyst Coaching 360, and this interview is one we've been working on a very long time. I met Dr. Curran over a beer when we were both attending a sports psychology conference in Germany about 5 years ago. I remember being impressed by him at the time, and then suddenly started seeing his name everywhere when his book shot to the top of the charts. The reason for that will be obvious as we discuss why perfectionists are actually limiting their performance, strategies for harnessing the potential positives without falling prey to the pitfalls, the role sledgehammers can play in the perfectionist journey, and what parents, educators, and leaders can do to turn the tide of perfectionism in a positive direction. For those who may be considering pursuing your MBHWC-approved coach certification, either to start a new career or perhaps expand your toolbox as a physical therapist, physician, counselor, or other related role, Catalyst Coaching Institute might just be worth a look. Our next cohort begins soon, and they have been filling up early, so please don't wait too long. You can access details on our institute site at catalystcoachinginstitute.com. It's a big decision, so please, if you'd like to talk it through, reach out to Susanna, our Chief Learning Officer, and she'd be happy to set up some time to answer your questions. Her direct email is susanna@catalystcoaching360.com, or direct line is 720-339-4292. Now, it's time to put perfectionism in its place with best-selling author Dr. Thomas Curran on the latest episode of the Catalyst 360 podcast. Professor Curran, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brad, for having me.
You're incredibly transparent about you, about your own life in your book. Kind of walk us through that. How did your personal experiences, observation lead you to this whole topic that is, it just needs to be talked about?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And thanks for reading the book and picking up on what I think was a really important part of the writing for me was the personal story, because I read a lot of self-help, sciencey self-help written by academics. And one of the things they're fascinating to me, but being in the area, it's easier for me to understand the concepts. And so I don't find them to be too dry. I find this to be fascinating. But if I speak to people around me, family, partner, there tends to be sometimes a perception among people who aren't naturally experts that it needs more story, it needs to be brought to life, it needs some way to connect with the experiences that people have. Right. And so that was a big challenge for me upon embarking on the writing journey. You know, can I connect those experiences and stories with the science? And I tried to do that from my own narrative, because if there's anybody that I know better than anyone else, of course, it's myself, and I am a perfectionist. And so I feel like there's a good foundation there for some, I think, hopefully illuminating case studies, illuminating experiences. And that's really why I studied it. You know, going back to your question, that is why I do this, because I myself have struggled with perfectionism a lot throughout particularly my 20s. Too much pressure on myself, working too hard, burning out, experiencing mental health problems, particularly anxiety, and generally just succumbing to that unrelenting pressure of trying to be perfect all the time. So that's what I tried to do in the book. I tried to connect those experiences, bring them to life, and really provide a case study of myself on why perfectionism is really challenging and how it can block our progress rather than push us forward.
And we'll get into some of the tips and guidance and that kind of stuff from the book. But in your own life, have you experienced a change? You're so in it, but you're also it's constantly being brought back up. So if it's an area of struggle, it's like, oh, here we go. I got to talk about my struggle again. So have you seen you change in this journey?
definitely. But I mean, that's the biggest thing about perfectionism. Perfectionism will just hold you back all the time. And with, being thrust, I suppose, into the spotlight for a very big study I did a few years ago, didn't have any choice. My university were like fully supportive of this, go out and do the TED talk, write the book, because these are things that are important for our exposure. They weren't thinking about me, but like, they're thinking, here's a good opportunity to put ourselves on the front pages of articles, inside pieces in newspapers, and of course, TED talk and book is big exposure. So I was very much encouraged to do this as part of my just everyday job. And here I was, not really a recognized individual, still not really a recognized individual. Let's be real about it. But nevertheless, now coming into the spotlight as somebody in the academic field who does work in the area of perfectionism, it's crazy. Like, it's crazy how much of a sledgehammer just that very process takes off your perfectionism, because you've got no choice. Like, unfortunately, you've got to put yourself in front of people and talk. Unfortunately, you've got to go on TV. You've got to do radio interviews and podcasts. You've got to stand in front of loads and loads of people. And all these things I would never have done by choice, because my perfectionism would have always said to me, that's going to be a really challenging situation. Do you want to put yourself in that situation? Do you want to, show all your weaknesses and limitations and all the rest of it? But having to let things go, just get out there, do it. It's like taking a sledgehammer, as I said, to perfectionism. And so through the process of just being thrust into this, I've found, just by a natural process of osmosis, I suppose, have been able to turn a major corner on perfectionism. Now, by the way, there are other things I've done, so it's not just having been thrust into the lineup. But nevertheless, it's really interesting actually how what you catastrophize in your mind as a perfectionist and how things are going to turn out is nowhere near reality, and actually you're way better than you think you are.
Multiple follow-ups to that. One, just off the top of my head, you've had over 3 million people watch your TED Talk. If you were to go back, what year was that? Was that about 3 years ago?
2018.
Okay, so about 5 years ago, 6 years ago from now. As you look back at that, do you think you would have presented the same concepts? Do you think you would have presented differently? You talk about it in the book. You talk about your nervousness. You talk about the leg. But as you think back, do you think it would have been a different Thomas Curran stepping up there today? Obviously, it's a different one, but do you see significant things that you would have done differently? Or do you just feel like, Brad, that's just such a unique stage. I was just glad to get a doggone thing done.
Well, I'd definitely be different. There's no doubt about that. Sure. I'd be way more confident with it. And I wouldn't be intimidated as much by people who are just incredibly good speakers. I think, as I said, I was thrust in there. I mean, I come from a working class background. I couldn't believe I even got into a PhD, never mind an academic post. And here I am invited to California to give a talk. And suddenly, like, everything is completely crazy. And people are really professional. They're really erudite. They're really confident. They know what they're doing. And I just didn't think I was anywhere near as good as they were. And of course, you go through the event and you calm down a little bit, but then as soon as your time comes, the nerves kick in and all the rest of it. And I talk about this in the book as being very overwhelming for me. I struggled a lot with that. Now, having had the experience and having done a lot of these sorts of things, I would be a lot more confident with it, but I still think there would be nerves. I don't think you ever completely get free of this. I still honestly believe that even though I'd be much better prepared, and I think I would say things slightly differently, or communicate the message slightly differently, nevertheless, I'd still struggle to remember all the different things that you got to remember for a TED Talk. And I don't think it would be the bulletproof, erudite speech of someone who does this for a living. I don't think I'll ever be at that level. But I think it would be a different experience for sure.
You use the phrase sledgehammer as you were describing your life, and you took a sledgehammer to perfectionism. And I love that visual. I don't know if that's one that you've I need to dig this into my interviews consistently, or if that's one that popped up somewhere, or if it just came naturally, but there's a lot of power in that statement. Can you take us through that phrase and why either it accidentally popped in or you've purposely chosen that word?
Well, the reason I think it's a really good metaphor is because with perfectionism, sometimes you've just got to do it. Brené Brown talks a lot about being brave, showing up. It's not a subtle thing. You don't kind of meekly change this thing or that thing, or tweak around the edges and kind of gently expose yourself to more and more. I think sometimes with perfectionism, it really is about just showing up and confronting that perfectionism head on and saying, no, you're going to tell me that I can't do this. And I'm just going to do it anyway. And so, I was thrust into that. I was forced to do that in some ways. I had no choice. So it's basically that there's a BBC and then on you go. Like, I didn't have any time to be like, I don't want to do this. It's just kind of like suddenly the cameras are on and away you go. But I think like through my experience, and also when you talk to people who have struggled with perfectionism, you talk to clinicians, people who work in the areas, to people like Paul Hewitt, Gordon Fleck, they'll tell you the same things. It's really important to make sure that first you recognize perfection as a problem, and then secondly, try to deal with it as recognize it and deal with it head on as you can. So push yourself into difficult situations, go through the anxiety and the discomfort that comes with failing or hitting setbacks or not doing something perfectly, and just learn to sit with that for a little bit, not doing anything with it, but just allowing it in. And then the more you do it, the more you put yourself out there, the more you allow yourself to fail, basically. The more comfortable you become, and the better. It's kind of crazy, but the better you perform. Like the more joy you'll feel as you're showing more of yourself and being true to yourself, pushing yourself out into the world and showing, being more comfortable in your own skin and being more comfortable to hit setbacks and all the rest of it. All these things, like paradoxically, are actually really important to success. And so, it's just a process of kind of, particularly at the beginning, of just kind of, right, we've got to do this. And it's like head down into the unknown. And that's uncomfortable. But over time, you find you live so much healthier and you perform better. I mean, look at where I am now to where I was 10 years ago. It's crazy.
You were forced into it. The person that's listening to this or reading your book, and they say, yeah, I definitely fit all the descriptors that he's laying out here. I want to move on. I'm not being forced into it. How do they move forward most effectively?
Well, the first thing is to recognize that this is as I said, you have the first step, and this is so important. This is why I wrote the whole book to try to dispel these myths around perfectionism being something that's necessary, something that's a lionized quality, something we need to be successful. It's not the case. And that's the first step, because perfectionistic people, and I include myself in this, will hold on to perfectionism for dear life, like, because it's the part of their identity that they cherish. And particularly when things are going wrong outside of maybe the work or sport, whatever it is that you're investing your time into, is going, when everything else outside of that activity is going wrong, we can fall back on our perfectionism and say, this is what's holding us up. Everything else is going wrong, but this is what, and that is the first step. It's so, so important. And I hope through reading the book, people realize that actually, yes, look, this is an impediment to success. It doesn't make us happier or healthier. And these are the reasons why. And so I need to turn the corner on this. And that's the first step. The second step then is to, as I mentioned, just try to get out little by little out of your comfort zone. And when I say little by little, I don't mean sort of tinker around the edges. I mean, what can seem a little thing like maybe putting your hand up for a talk is actually a very big thing for a perfectionist. So, this goes back to the sledgehammer analogy. But nevertheless, those little things in your life are really important to start doing. Yeah, particularly in the workplace. If you're not feeling up to public speaking, just test that perfectionism a little bit and put your hand up to do it. If you feel like leading a report or corralling a team to do some activities is not your skill set, again, put your hand up to take charge of an all hands meeting, or put your hand up to lead on a piece of code that perhaps your team is working with, or whatever it might be. Again, just to take yourself out a little bit of that comfort zone, show initiative and try something new. Those things are really difficult for the perfectionist because we like to kind of hide. We like to do our work in the background. And we do good work, don't get me wrong, but we'd never take credit for it. We would always be happy to let other people lead. And so what I'm saying is those little steps, they feel really tough, but actually the more you do them, as I mentioned, the more comfortable you become with showing up, the more comfortable you become with failure and making mistakes. All these things are going to be inevitable when you push yourself into new areas. Is really the start of a journey that ends in a sense of, okay, I am enough. I have skills. I have capabilities, and I don't mind putting myself into new situations because I know deep down that very stable sense of self-esteem. That's the end point. But getting there is really tough. And as I mentioned, you've got to challenge your perfectionism all the time. You've got to be more comfortable in your own skin, push yourself out there into the world and be kind to yourself in the process. And the more you do that, the happier you'll be. But interestingly, the data suggests the more successful you'll be too, because you're taking risks, you're trying to innovate, you're being creative, you're learning new skills. And all of those things are really important to performance. So it's just about turning, I suppose, looking at perfectionism for a different angle. And recognizing it's going to hold us back way more than it pushes us forward.
Maybe I'm unique in this, but when I think of a perfectionist, I think of a super high performer. And yet I'm hearing you say you're self-limiting. Because it has to be perfect, we only do things that we are comfortable with, that we've seen success with in the past, that we know we can dial it in and nail it. Am I hearing that correctly? And if so, is that one of the drivers? Because this is a high-performing individual in their heads, and yet they're not performing as high as they could because of that perfectionist limiting tendency.
So I think there's a couple of things to say on this. I try to explain as best I can in the book. Look, there's no doubt about it that perfectionism, you'll see perfectionism in high performers. And certainly there's an element of perfectionism that's carried me to a point in my career too.
Sure.
I don't think what I'm not saying is that perfectionism doesn't have those go-getting qualities. But what I'm saying is we have to be really careful about extrapolating from my experience, Jobs' experience, Bezos, Serena Williams, all of these wonderfully high and elite performers who themselves are self-confessed perfectionists, and extrapolate that must have been the secret to their success when there are so many other factors underneath that. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a whole book called Outliers on this phenomenon of survivorship bias, and how we have to be really careful from extrapolation, because there are other factors that could have been way more important, or just as important, I should say. So that's the first thing to say. And the second thing to say is that, once you've got over a certain threshold, the evidence for perfectionism's
being the driver,
being the driver performance is really weak. There comes a point where the relationship between effort and outcome it starts to weaken and then decline. This is a zone of diminishing and depleting resources to each additional unit of effort that we put in. Why? Because we're sacrificing areas of our life that are really important: rest, rejuvenation, sleep. We're also iterating, tinkering on things that don't need those, that should to be changed. And so we're actually blocking that innovative process where we're moving things forward, checking in our workings, going back, editing, and all the rest of it, because we're not letting things go.
Exactly.
Look, Jobs is a great example of someone who's incredibly perfectionistic, but and certainly it was one of the reasons behind his stunning success. But at the same time, it relied on him getting over a certain line for his perfectionism to run its course. Now, if he was unfortunate enough to have not been in the right place at the right time, and perhaps wasn't able to become a position where he's made those allowances, right? Because he was a difficult, complicated guy, and he was made a lot of allowances for his success.
Yeah.
Right. If he didn't get over that line, he would have been an incredibly difficult person to work with, but maybe perhaps wasn't given the allowances of being the CEO, and as a consequence may have struggled quite a lot in terms of his mental health and his relationship with other people. So again, there's a luck and there's a happenstance and there's right place and right time with all of these stories that I think we have to bear in mind. So look, I'm not saying perfectionism isn't crucial to a success at some level, but we have to be really careful about suggesting that perfectionism is the root of all success, and that if you look at the data, the link is quite weak.
Well, and you do a good job of explaining that in the book. My question was more along the lines of a perfectionist. If I'm a perfectionist, I think of myself as a high performer, but when I step back and look at the reality, I'm not performing at the level I potentially could because I'm putting these artificial barriers on the things I'm willing to step into. Is that realization often a driver to say, okay, I need to do what Thomas is talking about here. I need to step into some of these things that I'm not going to be perfect with. And I think I'm looking for that aha moment in the perfectionist, because it is part of their identity. And when it's part of your identity, don't take this away. I've got to stay a perfectionist. Wait. Are you a perfectionist or are you wanting to be a high performer? Because they're not the same thing.
No, and look, we live in a really tough world. The apex of society is narrow. The people we platform are 0.01%. If you want to feel like you've made something in this life, you've got to be exceptional.
Yeah.
That is not possible for the vast majority of people. And so there's a sense to which, there is a need to keep pushing and keep pushing and keep pushing, because otherwise just even an objectively high level of performance is not going to be enough. And I think this is why I think as for high performance individuals, people who listen to your podcast, I think it's really important to recognize that what you have achieved is remarkable. Even if you look out, there's more inequality in the 0.1% than there is in the 99.9%. If all you're doing is looking outside around you at your peers, there's never going to be a sense that you're ever enough, because there's always going to be somebody out there who's done better this year, next year, whatever, right? So I think at some point, high performance individuals have to realize that what they have done is remarkable, irrespective of whether the person next door has done more. And that really, our attention needs to flip. There has to come a point in our journey where we have to feel like what we have and what we've done is enough, and we can flip our attention not on continually more, better, growth, but actually, what's our purpose? What's our meaning? What's our vocation? What are we here for? What are we leaving in the world? Whether it be a company, whether it be an innovation, a technology, or whether it be a thought leadership or a book, whatever it is that we're leaving in the world, because that's that vocation should drive what we do now. What is the why of our existence? And rather than think too much about continually moving in a forward direction, think more about how we can make things better, or what we're doing for the world that's making a difference. And that subtle switch in motivation, again, is very important when it comes to turning our back on perfectionism, because growth is antithetical to abundance. There can be no abundance in a framework of growth, right? And perfectionism will thrive under conditions of growth, under conditions of scarcity, because scarcity is what drives growth. If there's no scarcity, then there's no growth to be had, right? If there's an abundance, then if there's an abundance, no growth to be had. But if there's scarcity, suddenly there's growth to be had. And so I think just switching that from, okay, I have an abundance around me. I've done remarkable things. So now I can afford to look more about the vocation of my work, rather than continually driving myself crazy about doing more. So that, I think that would be my message to high performers, is about finding that purpose and meaning.
Yeah, it's huge. That vision piece is something that comes up continuously. Can you share some practical strategies from your book that individuals, and you've touched on some of them, that individuals can utilize to break out of that trap that keeps grabbing onto them even as they start down that path?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is not going to be easy. And you got to expect perfectionism to come in almost on a daily basis. There's going to be situations where you feel like you just can't do this. Like I've put myself into a situation and I don't think I'm up to it. I think you've just got to, as I say, be kind to yourself. Self-compassion is really important in terms of perfectionism. If you're going to put more of yourself into the world, you're going to encounter more setbacks, more criticism, more rejection. These are things that, unfortunately, are part and parcel of living in a world that's really tough. And you have to be kind to yourself. You have to be kind to other people to give them support and help them show more of themselves too. I think once you start to turn the coin, you start to become more comfortable doing that, then you will find that you'll have more sustainable periods where perfectionism doesn't come into your life. I mean, this is certainly where I am now, and I can go onto a TV studio now and feel fairly comfortable. But nevertheless, I'll still get moments where I'm like, oh my God, I was giving a talk at Rotman the other night, and it was like I had to just stop and take a drink of water, because for some reason I'd become really nervous in that moment. So you still have moments where you kind of just feel like you're stepping backwards, but you come out the talk, you say, yeah, that's the way it is. Sometimes that happens. It's part and parcel of just, being a human being. You make mistakes. And then there are some other sort of micro strategies I think are really useful. The other thing that perfectionists do, and I still do this myself, is procrastinate, because procrastination is an anxiety management technique. We're trying to kind of offset the discomfort that comes from doing hard things. So I like to chunk work and remove distractions. This is such an important technique, by the way. It's really helped me. I just turn off everything: phone, browser, internet, everything, remove distractions, and open up a Word document, give myself 20 minutes and a 500 word target and just go, and it doesn't matter what you write. Obviously you have a task to do, but just get the thing started, and it's amazing. It's amazing once you have it got started, how fast you motor through. But the hardest thing to do, particularly if you're a perfectionistic person, is to get started. Yeah. So just get started. Again, this is something I do all the time for projects, assessments, talks. Just turn everything off and get started. I think other things that I try to, what I recommend to people are recognizing and that failure itself is a humanizing experience. So again, flipping the whole meaning of failure on its head to try to really make sure that you recognize whenever you've encountered those periods of difficulty, because we all make mistakes, like little mistakes. We slip up, we screw up, but sometimes we really fail, right? Sometimes we do something very, very wrong or badly, and the consequences are quite severe. And of course, perfectionistic people ruminate, they'll brood about that for a long time. I think on top of that, it's important to recognize that we're just imperfect. We are imperfect. We are going to make mistakes. There are going to be times when things go not well, and that's the moment at which it's sometimes can be quite important to remind ourselves that we are a human being, and yes, those things are going to happen, but there's something joyous just reminding ourselves that failure means we're human. Like if we were a robot and we never made mistakes, these experiences would never come into our lives. But the fact we're human is what's so enlivening, I suppose, about our existence, and part of that is about failure itself. So I try, whenever I've done something really bad or really screwed up really bad, which happens from time to time, to try and remind myself that without the lows there's no high, right? So right. This is just part of the deal. The new deal. So those are the kinds of things that I try to do in my own life and recommend for other people too.
Insecurity. You talk about early in the book. I think in my copy, it's page 26. High standards don't have to come with insecurity. It seems like you're saying it's perfectionism that grafts the two together. We all have insecurities. Do the perfectionists tend to extend those out over a broader spectrum, or are they concentrated in specific areas? Walk us through that grafting process.
Yeah, I mean, that's what drives everything. All of the drive, all of the high standards, all of the impression management, all of the neurotic striving comes from a place of insecurity, a place of lack, a place of scarcity, a place where we just don't feel like we're perfect enough. That's the perfectionist. That is the perfectionistic psychology in a nutshell. Now, it's expressed in different ways, and I talk about it in the book. It comes from within, comes from outside. We can put it on other people, but never the root starting point of all of that intense amounts of striving is from a place of insecurity, a place of lack. And look, we do all have insecurities. There's no doubt about that. When we put people in the lab and we give them some kind of stressful situation, or we tell them they failed at an activity, everybody has a reaction, right? Our shame increases a little bit. Our guilt increases a little bit. Our pride plummets. However, what you see time and time again, it's only the perfectionistic people where those things are prolonged, where those things are spiked and they're prolonged, right? In non-perfectionistic people, you see the dips, yes, of course, but they bounce back relatively quickly and they're able to move on to the next thing without too much scarring, right? Yeah. And this is the crucial distinction. And that's because perfectionistic people are motivated solely by preserving their sense of self, by hiding what they lack from the world. Whereas people who maybe are more conscientious, more meticulous, more diligent, they don't want to be seen as inferior. Of course not. But at the same time, they're able to see the bigger picture that, this is okay. All right. No worries. I didn't do well on that occasion. I feel a bit shit in the moment, but nevertheless, we're going to move on. We're going to keep going. What can I learn? How can I improve? And so, the next time they try a little bit harder. We see this again in the lab too. If you tell them, don't worry, you failed, but have another go, it will be those people that work the same, if not a little bit more on the second attempt. Whereas the perfectionist people will withdraw because they don't want to feel the feelings of shame and guilt again. So that's what I mean by insecurity. It really drives the perfectionistic person. And once you start there, you can really begin to unpack why it's so problematic for our mental health, because that's a really exhausting way to strive, but also why it can block performance, because it can force us to remove ourselves from situations so that we don't feel those spikes in negative emotions. So I think that's why it's so important to recognize insecurity as a root of perfection.
Perfectionists around us. It seems like a perfectionist parent or boss or coworker or friend or spouse or whatever could have a significantly strong impact, negatively strong impact on us. Can you give us any tips if we're around that person?
Yeah, there's loads. I mean, yeah, everybody will be able to recognize a perfectionist in their environment. And if they tend to turn those standards on other people too. Not all perfectionists do this, by the way. So some can be quite insular and the perfectionism is turned very much inward. But sometimes you can see it turned outwards as well. And these people are really difficult to work with because they can create a lot of social disharmony, right? Particularly when things haven't gone well. They're very quick to point fingers. They can be very punitive actually in their evaluation, and that can create a lot of team difficulty. We see that in the literature all the time. This is correlated with disharmony within teams. In romantic relationships, it's correlated with much lower levels of relational satisfaction, sexual satisfaction. Even in social settings too, just outside of the family or workplace, you see other perfectionists experience a lot of social disconnection because they're just kind of forced away from social situations. People that basically don't want to spend time with them, and so you also have to. This is the reason I'm saying is context, because you have to bear this in mind when you experience these people, that this is a projection of their own standards onto others. So this is not a you thing. This is a them thing, right? Like, so they are. It's a kind of what Freud would call projection. They're trying to soothe their own anxieties about their hot unrelenting standards by projecting them outwards, and it's creating a substantial amount of difficulty in their life. So I think we have to approach these interactions with empathy and recognize that this is much more a problem of the person who's directing his perfectionist standard than it is of you. And if we start from that point, then we can begin to have open and honest conversations, empathetic conversations about why it is that the standards you feel are being imposed on you are unreasonable, right? Why is it that I'm given 2 weeks to write this report? I don't think that's reasonable. It would take me 3 weeks at a fast clip, but typically 4 if we're working at a normal pace. So why have you given me 2? Right? This is unreasonable. This is going to force me to work way beyond comfort, and that's going to have impact on other areas of work life and personal life. We need to talk about this. Can we have a chat? Right? Again, talking, open channels of communication. Let's figure this out. Don't let those impossible standards stew. Don't just leave them and then find that at the end of the time period, we haven't got the work done, and now the relationships are even more deteriorated. It's so important to be preemptive. It's so important to be upfront. That's at work. If you feel like your parents are imposing too many expectations or too higher expectations, again, it's the same story. It's really important to talk to your parents to say, look, this is too much. I'm struggling here. I feel like I've got lots of different priorities, lots of different deadlines, and it's really important that I'm given a little bit of capacity, a little bit of scope to come back with perhaps a B or even a C grade because of the competing pressures that are being put on me. And that's not a disaster. That's just the part and parcel of having to cope with many different expectations. Again, clear lines of communication, talk about what's expected, and if we can do that empathetically, you find that you're in your own psychology, you're relieved because you've got it out. it's off your chest. But also when it comes to our team and the people that we're working with, that's been said now. So, if there's no flexibility and there's a rigid expectation, well, oh, look, we didn't get there. You've put it on record. You've had your say, and this is the outcome. So again, that validation helps next time to go, okay, well, we didn't listen to what I was saying before. Maybe we should listen to it now. Can you see what I mean? So it's so important that you talk about those expectations, because if they're unreasonable, it needs to be outlined.
And as you're describing that, I'm thinking of, and you mentioned the survivorship bias in the past, who's held up? It's Tiger Woods' parents. It's Serena's dad. It's Elon Musk. It's Steve Jobs, who you already mentioned. It's these football coaches. So we're getting in the press and in the popular literature, this is the way to do it. And so the boss says, oh, yeah, you got to have high standards like Elon Musk. That's why he's got 15 companies that are blah, blah, blah. Or you've got to be this football coach. You got to be this parent to have these high performers. And yet that's 5 people out of 300, it's crazy numbers. And yet it's what we see. How do you suggest combating that inaccurate survivorship bias ratio?
Yeah, well, I think sometimes you just got to look at the maths. I mean, these are Six Sigma individuals. Nassim Taleb did a recent experiment or analysis. Basically, he was using cyclists, like elite cyclists. And he found that in order to be in the peloton, you need to be a Six Sigma individual, basically unhuman, if you really want. Right. Because the aerobic capacity that's needed to just compete, never alone win, right, is so unlikely, improbable as to be, almost impossible for the vast majority of us. And we can, it might not be quite as dramatic in other fields as it is in cycling, because it's a very specific sport that requires a very specific fitness, but nevertheless, and genetic makeup. But nevertheless, if it comes to CEOs, if it comes to managers, parents, sports people in other sports, it's so like the chances of us making it over that threshold is so improbable, and the factors that led to the success go beyond what we ourselves do, especially in fields of business and enterprise. Look, I'm really sorry, there's probably a controversial statement, but if you look at the hard data in the UK, we have something called the Sunday Times Rich List, right? 90% of people there are privately educated. Right. So, in terms of like the deck, and by the way, only 9% of people in the United Kingdom are privately educated. So, in terms of like the deck being stacked against the vast majority of people from the outset of making the rich list in the UK, if that's your criteria, is such a steep hill to climb that you do have to wonder whether we should be platforming these individuals and using them as examples of realistic case studies. Again, this goes back to Malcolm Gladwell's argument around outliers, that survivorship bias dupes us by thinking that, if we just put the effort in, we'll get to the top. It's kind of more complicated than that. That just needs to be a conversation we have collectively, by the way. Like, I love listening to podcasts. I love the Diary of the CEO and High Performance, and all this sort of stuff. Really interesting insight from people, but don't think that you can learn from them how to get to the top. Their experiences are fascinating. Right. Some of the things that they put in place, their productivity might be helpful. Yes. But we have to also remember there are other factors that aren't discussed on those shows that are just as important. So I think it's just having a conversation about what is actually realistic and recalibrating our expectations as a society as to what's realistic. I mean, we used to do this, right? After the war, our economy worked to build up the middleman, the average Joe, the Flintstones, Jetsons. These were the heroes of American society, because they reflected the people that were doing well, right, as the economy was growing. Now, the only people that do well as the economy grows today are the very, very richest, which is why those people are platformed as success stories. And I just think as a collective, we need to have a discussion, a grown-up discussion about what success is. And what's realistic. So, that's, I don't know if there's any snippets of help or tips there, but I think this is why I broaden the lens a bit in my book, because I think this is just as much a collective issue as it is a personal.
I don't know if you've heard or read David Epstein's book on range. He was kind of the he and Malcolm are friends, but he's the other side of that, of presenting that. And I love, we had him on the show a few years ago, and I loved his message is what you're describing now of, yes, these are the outliers. There's this much bigger picture that is not being seen out there. Oh man, there's so much I want to talk about here. So Adam Grant wrote a testimonial for your book. I'm a big fan of his, and just so happened, as soon as I closed the cover on your book, I picked up his new book. And he talks about the imperfectionist, the person who understands we've got to choose our battles, those areas in which we can pursue the highest standards. And I love how you've clarified both in this interview and in your book. It's not about not having high standards. It's about grafting that with the insecurity that requires it in all aspects. Is that, I guess, part of the perfectionist struggle, hindrance, that they can't pick and choose? They can't is the wrong word. They have difficulty picking and choosing. They want to be perfect across the board.
Yeah, but it's never enough. Whatever happens is never enough. Because the whole thing is driven by scarcity. And if you live in a permanent state of scarcity, then it will never be enough. And this is what I'm trying to unpick in the book. Really, it's about the subtitle of my book is The Power of Good Enough. And really what I mean by that is finding a place in our lives where we can feel like we are enough. And that doesn't preclude high standards. It doesn't preclude doing things that are remarkable. Absolutely not. But what it means is that when we strive, when we go for goals, when we work at something, that we can do so with a very secure sense of self-esteem that isn't going to be completely uprooted by every tiny setback and mistake. And in order to do that, we have to, at some level, feel secure in ourselves. We have to, at some level, feel like we're enough. So perfectionism, in its broadest sense, is a reflection of our economy. And this is why I go into a critique of growth at the end of the book, because essentially perfectionism is really the archetypal personality type of what's needed in this economy. People who feel like they're never enough, to keep striving, keep consuming in order to grow the economy, because, the economy doesn't thrive in the conditions of abundance. It collapses tomorrow. Right. So this, what's the paradox of capitalism is that it provides all this abundance. There's no doubt about that. Look at the record. Remarkable success story. But it never allows us to enjoy it. It can't possibly allow us to enjoy it because it has to continue to grow. It's the same with perfectionism. Perfectionist people do remarkable things, but it will never, ever, 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 ever let you enjoy that success, because there's always the next thing, and there's always the next thing, and there's always the next thing. This is the curious symmetry between the two that I tried to explore in the book. But at a personal level, it's so important to try and break that link. You have to at some point recognize that these impulses are doing us more harm than good, particularly if they were left unchecked and they're let to run their own course. And we have to at some point turn our back, turn our corner, and think differently about what success means, about why we're striving, and push more for, as I mentioned earlier, things like vocation, things like meaning, things like purpose, things like what we're leaving in the world as to be our, intrinsic motives, I suppose, rather than worrying constantly about what other people are thinking, pleasing other people, and making sure we're hiding and disguising those imperfections in the world so that people don't see them. Those two forms of striving get you to the same place. If anything, the evidence suggests that if you strive for intrinsic reasons, you're going to be more successful. But they do so without the emotional baggage that comes with perfectionism. So it's so important, as the subtitle of my book says, to find the good enough and embrace the power of good enough, because that's the route, in my opinion, to success and happiness.
Let's stay on the you weren't specifically in money there, but you mentioned it in several different contexts. Let's stay on that for a second. You do talk about finances, debt among perfectionists frequently, frankly. And I kept thinking, what if, and I'm looking for your opinion on this, what if there was better guidance on financial literacy, if you will, of budgeting and spending money? Because it seems like so many of the struggles that's not at the base. That's the wrong phrase, but it is significant. If you're in debt because you didn't talk to someone with some wisdom about paying a crazy amount for a college education that was not going to provide an ROI at the wrong school. You could have gotten the same education at this other place, and you are a professor at a very highly esteemed university, so you can be careful on whatever you want to do with this. But you know what I'm saying? So, or you don't need the new car. The used car gets you to work. You don't need the new clothes. I just, as I was reading, I'm just like, oh my gosh, this is a self-imposed problem. If we would be wiser in this one area, it would take the pressure off. And that pressure is bringing out all these other, not all, many of these other things that you're bringing to the forefront. They wouldn't have to be there if the debt wasn't the undercurrent. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, listen, I agree with you 100%. But my I suppose my retort would be, let's imagine a world in which everybody did that. Let's imagine a world where everybody was frugal, where everybody withheld consumption or offset consumption for, thinking about future prosperity, right? They basically saved more than they spent. The economy, as it's currently operated, is going to be under a lot of pressure. The demand, the lack of demand that would happen overnight would spend it into a spiraling recession. So, there's a sense, and this is what I agree 100% with what you're saying. We, as individuals in a society, we do have a responsibility to make sure that we live sensibly and responsibly. But we are bombarded with messaging about what we lack, about what we don't have, about what we need in order for us to live a respectable and dignified life. And all of that typically includes things we can purchase: cars, clothes, and those things that you mentioned. And it requires the whole, to have education, to have healthcare, to have policing and military, and all these things that we have as a society. It requires us to continually consume and work to consume for those things. Now, as debt is an important part of this story, because it used to be the case that what you earned, you could use to buy the things that you needed, right? So cars, clothes, like your debt wasn't.
And you don't think that's a thing anymore?
No, not at all, because what we see now is increasingly people are spending through credit. Why? Because wages have gone nowhere, but cost of living is exponentially increased. So there's a sense that they don't have any choice but to take on debt. Housing is a great example of this, by the way, right? Housing backstops a lot of consumption in the economy, right? A lot of these consumptions in today's economy is backstopped by housing. And the reason why we can afford to continue to buy these things is because the debt we take on at some level is being propped up by exponential rises in house prices. Sure. And that's why every single recession in living memory is sparked by a crisis in housing. Because as soon as the house prices crash, the whole debt-driven consumption goes down with it. And of course, the lender of last resort is the government steps in to prop everything up. Now, we're going a little bit off perfectionism, but the reason why I think this is important is because the only way we've been able to sustain growth in a growth-dependent economy is through the expansion of the monetary system, increasing amounts of debt, which basically have been facilitated by record low interest rates since the financial crisis, and an exponential boom in asset prices. And what that's created in turn is a kind of false sense of growth, which is zero sum, i.e. it's enriched a lot of people, but it's also made life a lot more difficult for others. People have to take on debts, young people, poorer people. And as a consequence, this intense pressure to just grow, instead of creating a strong foundation for the meeting of people's needs, which it used to do, right, in the post-war era. That's to say, that growth lifted everybody up. Now, pursuing more and more growth is not meeting people's needs. In fact, life expectancy is declining, educational outcomes, the decline in poverty is increasing, opioid addiction and drug addiction is on the rise too. We're getting growth, but it's not meeting human needs. Why? Because it's now a zero-sum game. Some are winning, many are losing, and the people that are losing are experiencing stress. They're experiencing lots of anxiety. Depression is on the increase. Perfectionism on the increase, which I think is a part of this story too. And so this is this complete obsession with growth that is channeled through an expansion of the credit system, which is not meeting the needs of young people in particular, which I think is part of the perfectionism story. Not the only part, but I think a big piece of it. And that's why I focus a little bit of attention in the book on debt and expansion of credit, because I think it's an important part of the puzzle.
Well, and it would not be wise of me to get into an economics macro argument with a professor from the London School of Economics, but I agree. I agree on an extreme level, on a macro level, everything that you just said. I think I'm wondering about it at a micro level. So yes, if all of us stop spending money, we've got issues that you described very well. But on a micro level, we teach a finance class in our community. It's a free thing. I'm no finance expert, but we try to get people out of debt. We just sit down with them and we go through the basics. They're just basics. And everybody's like deer in the headlights. Whoa, like, wow, I've never heard this before. And we're just thinking there's three of us to teach the class. We're just like, this is so basic. And yet you're right. You've never heard this before. And so I think my question as I was reading it was, I was just thinking in that context, would that be a good starting point for the perfectionists to take that stressor off the table by pursuing some, at a micro level, some greater wisdom when it comes to our debt? Because yes, the messages are out there, but we choose to read those messages. We choose to act on them. You do a great job talking about social media. If that's driving the purchases, then guess what? Get my butt off social media, et cetera, et cetera. And easier said than done. I'm sitting here in my high tower saying, oh yeah, we got that figured out. But it just seems to me like it's not the issue, but it seems like it's a pretty significant one at a micro level.
I agree. I don't disagree with you at all. And one of the reasons I wanted it was exactly to educate and inform on these issues. Like, it doesn't have to be like this. You don't have to consume your way out of misery. Yes. Like, it really doesn't. Like, feeling like we're abundant can mean so many things. It can mean a big house, but it can also mean community. It can mean, that we're doing something of purpose and of worth. Our relationships, like that, can just be just as much of a sense of abundance as it is, living in a massive house in the suburbs with a fancy car and all the rest of it. That for me really is the big message of the book, that we're at all times bombarded with this messaging that the only route to happiness and success is through material purchases, which unfortunately today it means debt. That actually no, it's not about that at all. There are things that are priceless, which are just as important. And that's really, like, if you want to condense what I'm trying to argue in the book on a macro level, that's really what I'm trying to argue, that if we can understand the macro and what's going on, then on a micro level, we can make more informed choices. So I agree with you.
Yeah. Very good. All right. I got way more questions than we're going to get through. So let me just pick a couple of these out here. Let's see. Your personal story that you share, dude, like, you've crushed it. I get it. You got your stuff. But you're in your mid-30s. You're a best-selling author. You're a professor at a world-renowned university. You've had over 3 million people watch your TED Talk. Your perfectionist has put you in a good place. Are there strategies for dialing it back so that you can enjoy the fruits of those labors that could be other people could extend to their own lives?
Yeah, I mean, that's, again, this is your target audience is a high performing people who have had a lot of success in their lives. They are where I am. This advice would be very different, by the way, to people starting out in the. I wouldn't give the same advice, but what I would say to your audience is that, you have to, at some level, recognize that what you've done in your life is really amazing. Yeah, and ask yourself, your 18-year-old self or whatever, like if you could tell them that you would be in this position at whatever age it is you are, would they believe you? Would they think that that's an amazing accomplishment? Because I can do that, and I can tell you 100% that my 18-year-old self wouldn't even know what a professorship at LSE meant. So this, is mind blowing in terms of the success. And you have to enjoy it. Like, you have to, at some level, recognize you've done something remarkable. You've built a company. You've done incredible things in a sport. Perhaps if you're a sports person, you've made it to the very top in your field. If you're an artist or whatever it is that in your area of expertise you've excelled in, and just enjoy that. Like, tell yourself that is an amazing accomplishment. That doesn't mean stop. That doesn't mean going to sit up on a beach in Mexico and just enjoy the rest of the retirement or whatever. That's not what that means. But what that means is that I think, for me anyway, what I've tried to do, and this has helped me so much over everything, when it comes to doing interviews, when it comes to writing books, when it comes to thinking of research projects or going for grants, is not focusing on the outcome, like what's the revenue, what's the growth, what's the profit and loss, but focusing on the vocation. I kind of touched on this, but it's really important. And I've featured my grandfather in the book because my grandfather, I think, is really helpful for me in flipping what I think should be the way to strive. My grandfather was a carpenter. He made everyday things for people to use: staircases, banisters, chairs, tables, bar tops, and all that sort of stuff. Nothing spectacular, but they were really important. People needed them.
Yeah, absolutely.
To walk up to a different floor or to look out of a window. Right. These things are essential for people's lives. And, they still stand, by the way. His works are still in the local area, in some of the pubs where he renovated. And that's testament really to his vocation. Right, that he's left something in the world that's durable, that looks good, doesn't bear his name, of course. Like, it's not got William Curran embossed all over but nevertheless, that was his vocation. That was his left in the world, and that's what gave him pride and accomplishment. Just giving something leaving something in store for other people to use was enough for him to go home, drink a scotch, watch the football, and get up the next day. That was his vocation. And I think there's something incredibly insightful there, and something we can learn from, about how once we've reached a certain point in our career, it's so important to flick the switch and say, what is our vocation? Like, what is it that we're leaving in the world? Not worry about the outcomes, because we're in the privileged position where we don't have to worry about them. But what is it that I want to leave in this world? And it could be a book, it could be a podcast, it could be a TED talk. It could be a company that's driven by a social mission, right? There's something that you genuinely believe, and if it's profitable alongside that, that's wonderful. But something you genuinely believe is going to make a difference to the world. Whatever it is, that should be the focus that drives you. That should be the thing that you strive for. And trust me, you'll be just as successful working towards goals for that reason than you will be to please other people or to hit targets or to meet goals and all the rest of it. All of these external things that can, really drive us to exhaustion. So that's my one big picture message to people, particularly high performance people, that, their vocation is so, so important.
Yeah, Thomas, that's beautiful. Last question. I know I'll get calls and emails from our listeners if I don't ask this, but for parents and educators, they're trying to help children navigate the fine line between that striving for excellence and that falling into the perfection trap. And children, I'll put quotes around it, from the 4, 5, 6-year-old to the high schooler, just some general guidance for that, again, parent or educator who's listening to you and saying, yeah, I'm seeing this. I want to help these kids. What can we do?
Well, the first thing to say is, as I mentioned a minute ago, my advice would be very different to someone coming out of college, which would be, you live in a really tough economy right now, and you got to kind of push yourself, and that's that's the reality, right? And that pushing yourself might include perfectionistic tendencies, which are important to be aware of, important to reflect on, important not to let them run their course, but nevertheless are an important part of the mix. That's not the case for high performers. But this is so dealing with, parenting, it becomes a challenge then, doesn't it? Because you have to tread a really difficult or fine line between, the right amount of pushing and expectations and structure, but at the same time, not letting that overspill into neurotic compulsive tendencies, which, come from insecurity and a fragile sense of self-esteem. So there are a couple of ways you can do that. I think the first is you've got to lead by example. You've got to show kids, the most important thing is to show up, right? So you've got to show up, right? And talk about that. Go home, say, I pushed my boundaries today. I gave a talk where I didn't prepare 100% because there wasn't enough time and it didn't go well, and laugh about it. Because the message you're communicating is, you tried and it didn't go well, but that's okay. Like, it's very humanized, it's very normal. This is part of the process of pushing the boundaries and trying new things. So normalizing failure, normalizing mistakes, normalizing getting out of your comfort zone to your kids, because they learn this. They see in the parents, they'll quickly learn that's a really positive thing. But secondly is consistency of approval. So the temptation among parents can be sometimes when they're pushing really hard is to defer approval when they haven't done well. So let's say they get a C grade or a B grade or something, right? And you say, okay, we know that's not really sufficient in school to get you into the top colleges. So we know there's a problem there that needs to be addressed. But if you can be too direct about that, right? Like, you can withhold the approval and praise in those moments on the expectation that they keep working harder. And you can do that again and again and again and again and again. And all the child learns over that journey is that when they've done something wrong or they've got a substandard performance, or they're less in their parents' eyes, right? So that again, they're only really worse than when they've excelled. So then the whole self-esteem becomes tied to the excellence. So again, high standards important, structure important, having high goals is important. Make sure they're realistic. Okay, that's really important. But nevertheless, there's nothing wrong with having expectations of kids. But when they've done well or when they haven't done quite so well, consistency of approval is so important. Don't fall into the trap of deferring that praise. Make sure if they failed, put an arm around them, let them know it's okay, let them know it's not an indictment on them. Doesn't say anything about how much the teacher likes them, doesn't say anything about how much the parent likes them either. It's just one test over many, many tests. The important thing is to keep going, keep trying. And next time things will be better, right? Or, next time you'll be in a better position to make sure that you address what went wrong on that occasion. So consistency of approval, humanizing, normalizing failure and mistakes and imperfections is also important. And if you can get those two things right, I think you can tread that balance. But it's not easy. It's really tough to be a parent. And I think you have all of my empathy and sympathy because it's a tough job.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thomas, so appreciate it. You've created a very important book at a very important time. And I appreciate you coming on and sharing some more insights with us.
Thanks, Brad. It was great to chat.
Such valuable insights on a critical topic right now. I hope you were able to find a nugget or two in there for you. Our long-term listeners may have noticed a format change we started with this episode based on what we learned from Professor Curran. We'll look forward to hearing what you thought of it, if you happen to notice. If you're an employer thinking about how you can support your employees' physical and mental well-being in light of what we discussed today, Catalyst Coaching 360 might be worth a look. The 360 in the name references the totality of life that is addressed by the nationally board certified coach, always in a manner that's directed by the employee based on what's most important to that individual. It's not simply about food and fitness, and it's never a lecture about a bunch of shoulds. Rather, it's a highly credible behavior change specialist coming alongside to help lend a hand and an ear about any aspect of life that's important to you or your employee team members going forward. If you'd like to discuss how easy it is to integrate into your current program or platform, reach out anytime. Results at catalystcoaching360.com or visit the website catalystcoaching360.com. And now it's time to be a catalyst. This is Catalyst Coaching 360's Dr. Brad Cooper. Make it a great rest of your week, and I'll speak with you soon on the next episode of the Catalyst 360 podcast, or maybe over on the YouTube coaching channel.